All right, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for braving the weather and coming out this evening. I am Brooke Clement. I'm the director here at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, which is part of the National Archives and Records Administration. And it is a distinct pleasure to have you here this evening. As always, I'm going to express my sincere appreciation to our partners, the Gerald Ford Foundation and its staff, for their continued and truly valued support of the library and museum. Before we start, please ensure that your cell phones are either turned off or are set to silent. And while you do that, I'm going to briefly highlight some of our upcoming events here at the Ford Library. Tomorrow at 3:30, author Jean Alicia Elster will be here for our March's Reading Month program. It will be a family-friendly program and will focus on learning and sharing family histories through oral histories. On April 1st, we will have a new exhibit in this room entitled Opening the Vault, the Northwest Ordinance, and it is a special display that will feature the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which will be on loan from the National Archives and Records Administration. The display offers a rare opportunity to view a document that helped shape the ideals and values of this young nation. The exhibit is going to be free, open to the public, and will close on April 30th. April 28th, Ford Foundation Executive Director Gleaves Whitney will discuss the significance of the Northwest Ordinance and its impact on civic and political culture. And on May 7th, legal scholar and professor Akil Reed Amar will join us to discuss his latest book, Born Equal: Remaking America's Constitution. For more details on these and other programs, please visit our website at fordlibrarymuseum.gov. And now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Thomas DeFrank. Mr. DeFrank is one of Washington's most respected president watchers, a political journalist, and an author. He is the senior correspondent regularly covering the White House and a contributing editor at National Journal. From 1996 to 2012, he served as the Washington bureau chief of the New York Daily News. He is a former president of the Gridiron Club and the White House Correspondents Association, the two most prestigious journalist organizations in the nation's capital. During his distinguished career, DeFrank was Newsweek's senior White House correspondent for a quarter century. He has covered 11 presidents and 15 presidential campaigns, reporting on the resignation of one president, the impeachment of a second, and was an eyewitness to 2 assassination attempts against a third. His reporting has earned high praise, one compliment of which came from President Gerald Ford himself, who called him one of the finest journalists I have ever known. Please join me in welcoming Mr. DeFrank to the stage.
Thank you, Brooke, very much for the overly generous introduction. Thanks to you and Joel for taking such good care of me, as well as all the staff. I've had a wonderful time back here down memory lane. My time with Gerald Ford lasted for a third of a century, and Shakespeare called those days halcyon days of yore. I prefer the formulation of an old Texas Ranger who used to refer to moments like my wonderful moments with President Ford as the sunny slopes of long ago. Now, if you've read Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry, that line is in his book. He plagiarized it off a tombstone in a cemetery in Weatherford, Texas, but that's another story. I've been reveling here in Grand Rapids and Ann Arbor about the sunny slopes of long ago, and I really appreciate the chance to be back at a place that meant so much to President Ford. Brooke's introduction, however, reminds me of a story. It's the one of many you'll hear tonight. In November of 1974, as President Ford flew home from the port city of Vladivostok after meeting with Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev. That was my first trip abroad with the president. I peeled off to travel to what was then known as Peking, not Beijing, Peking, with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who was laying the groundwork for a Ford visit to China the following year, 1975. The Chinese treated Kissinger as a minor deity, and after a particularly over-the-top introduction, Kissinger began his remarks by noting, "That's an introduction I so rarely receive and so richly deserve." I know better. I think Brooke knows better, but that's not an introduction I so richly deserve, but I thank you for it anyway. But that's an introduction out of the norm. I'm more used to the type of introduction I got in 2000. In 2000, when George W. Bush described me to a fellow governor as a good man for his ilk. Truthfully, a good man for his ilk is delighted to be in Ann Arbor today after a great day in Grand Rapids yesterday to remember our 38th president, a man who was extremely kind to me, professionally and personally, and especially kind to my family for more than a third of a century. Not to mention old friends and comrades in arms, like Marty Allen and Elaine Didier, Richard Norton Smith, Stacy Davis, here from the staff. Nice to be back among friends. You don't need me to tell you how Gerald Ford loved Michigan. He spent many happy retirement years in Rancho Mirage, California, and Beaver Creek, Colorado, but this was his home with a capital H. It wasn't just the place he was from, it was who he was. One of his favorite words was one that I had never heard in my life before I started covering him. Michigander. I'm a proud Michigander, he used to say. And in fact, one of his first directives to his staff after being sworn in as vice president was to get him back to Michigan, to Grand Rapids and Ann Arbor. First, he went to Grand Rapids. That's my press credential from that day. And then a few months later, he went to Ann Arbor. And that's my press credential on that trip. Today, I'm going to start with one of my favorite stories, and it shouldn't surprise you that it's not a coincidence that it has to do with Ann Arbor. On that first trip back to Ann Arbor in the spring of 1974, there was an unscheduled stop. Wasn't on our schedule, but Vice President Ford wanted to see the stadium, the scene of so many happy memories for number 48. So by then I'd been traveling more or less nonstop with Vice President Ford, and an easy camaraderie had developed between Ford and the half dozen reporters who regularly traveled with him on a tiny twin-engine prop jet, a very unimperial Air Force II. It was so slow we called it Slingshot Airways. Anyway, he wants to go to the stadium. So we get to the stadium and we walk in, and because friendships is the wrong word, but because friendly relationships had developed among the 6 regular reporters on the plane and the vice president, I decided to have a little fun. So as we're going into the stadium, Michigan Stadium, I say to him, "You know, Mr. Vice President, there are high school football stadiums in West Texas that are much more imposing than what I'm seeing here." And he looks at me with what I later described as, "What planet did you just come in from?" look. And he said, "Tom, why don't you wait until we go inside before making another judgment?" So we go in, and you know the rest of the story. I was blown away, just totally blown away. And it reminded me, not at the moment, but it reminds me of when Richard Nixon went to China in 1972, and he went to the Great Wall, and a reporter asked him, "What do you think of the Great Wall?" And he said, This is truly a great wall. Well, that stadium, as you know much better than I, that is truly the big house. And I can still remember Vice President Ford's big, booming laugh behind me as I'm looking at this massive, monstrous, beautiful stadium that I had, in my ignorance, denigrated. Now, inside the stadium, we left him alone because we knew we could just tell by his demeanor and looking around that old number 48 was having a lot of fun with halcyon days of yore. So we walked back to the motorcade, and I don't know what to say. And he gets to the limousine, and he turns to me and he says, "Just remember, Tom, go blue." That was the first time I ever heard the phrase, "go blue." And whenever I see a Wolverine football game or a NCAA tournament, I think the basketball team is doing very, very well, my mind's eye goes to the first time I heard "go blue." Go blue. He was watching Michigan football games at the end of his life in 2006. He was a fanatic. And so that was quite a memory for me watching him. But today I've been asked to reminisce not about Ann Arbor, but about one of the most historically important, if regrettably, largely overlooked aspects of the Ford presidency. His stewardship of the Bicentennial celebration of 1976, called the American Adventure. I'll come back to in just a moment to why it was called the American Adventure. It's an interesting story. That's a bound volume of his 6 speeches. It's in pristine condition, and I've said to my 30-year-old son, Andrew, when you find this, don't pitch it. It's important. The American Adventure, and this, of course, is the centerpiece here of his bicentennial remarks, Independence Hall, Philadelphia, July 4th. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. But first, I'm going to digress one more time to tell one of my favorite story behind the story vignettes from my almost 7 decades covering the White House. And my 30-year-old son said, "Dad, this is a very dubious distinction," and maybe it is, but it is true. I'm the last reporter still covering the White House who covered the White House in 1976. That's why I call it once in a lifetime, although I've been lucky. I'm about to have been to my second bicentennial-like celebration in 50 years. But back to my digression. Richard Nixon loved historic firsts. He was the first president to visit the People's Republic of China in February of 1972, as I mentioned earlier. Even before Peking, now Beijing, he was thinking about another historic first. He was particularly looking forward to presiding over America's 200th birthday on July 4th, 1976. Months before the centennial, actually more than a year before the bicentennial, I said centennial, but I meant the bicentennial, Nixon told friends and political advisors the Democrats would nominate Senator George McGovern, which they did, and Nixon said the South Dakota Democrat was just too liberal to be elected. Nixon was so confident that he would wipe the floor with Senator McGovern, which of course he did, that more than a year before the election, in a moment of what I should say is Trumpian-style hubris, he renamed the presidential aircraft to honor the bicentennial. For bonus points, does anybody here remember what Air Force One became by order of Richard Nixon? Stacy, you know, that's not fair. I know you know the answer. Anybody else know the answer? Okay, yes, sir. You and Stacy tie, that's right. The spirit of 76. This is the day Richard Nixon and Mrs. Nixon coming down the stairs She's down there already with him. This is the day they arrived in China, and you can see the Spirit of 76 emblazoned right below the cockpit on both sides of the aircraft. Not only did they change the name on the airplane, the notepads, the menus, everything on the airplane, the seating charts, everything was renamed Welcome Aboard the Spirit of 76. And that only happened for a little over a year or two. And I've said to my son, don't throw those things away. I've got tons of Air Force One memorabilia, and I've got a lot, but not tons, of Spirit of 76 memorabilia. So anyway, Spirit of 76. So, what happened? We know what happened. Watergate happened. Instead of leaving office in a bicentennial glow, in the famous phrase of his speechwriter William Safire, Nixon was back in San Clemente, California on the bicentennial, trying to salvage his tattered reputation after resigning in disgrace. Pride goeth before a fall, maybe, I guess. And it was Gerald Ford, my favorite Michigander, who led the nation that day in celebrating its 200th birthday, which is why I'm here today. But one last digression, but it's a relevant footnote. President Trump has certainly been luckier than President Nixon. During the 2024 campaign, President Trump issued a press release announcing that once he was president, he would be honored to host the country's 250th birthday, the semi-quincentennial. And so he will. Candidate Trump also declared he'd create, quote, the most spectacular birthday party in the history of the world. Not in the history of the country, the history of the world. Spectacle, get ready, absolutely. Spectacular, to be determined, we'll know soon. Now, back to the future and Gerald Ford's bicentennial. By all accounts, President Ford was a bit slow out of the gate, gearing up for the big day. For the first several months of his presidency, his loyal counselor, John O. Marsh, Jr., known within the White House as the bicentennial freak, much to his irritation, was a voice in the wilderness, trying to remind everybody, but most of all President Ford, that the bicentennial was approaching and you couldn't do it and get ready in 6 weeks. Jack Marsh and Jerry Ford were colleagues in the House of Representatives for 8 years. Jack was a conservative congressman from Virginia. When Ford became vice president in December of 1973, he asked Jack Marsh to be his national security advisor. Marsh was a certified history buff. He loved to point out proudly that if Thomas Jefferson were alive today, he would have been my constituent, which was true. But Marsh's real historical passion was the bicentennial. In 1963, Marsh introduced the first congressional resolution urging the creation of a national bicentennial commission, 13 years ahead of his time. But for months, Jack Marsh had been delicately prodding his friend to start birthday planning with little success, almost zero success. Finally, that changed, and what changed President Ford's lethargy, indifference, whatever you want to call it, was Ford's visit to Boston's Old North Church on April the 18th of 75. Some of you will remember the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem. 'Twas the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is still alive, blah, 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 blah. Old North Church, one if by land, two if by sea. Ford spoke there, and he really liked it. He really started to get into the bicentennial thing. The next day, April the 19th of 1975, he visited the iconic venues where the Revolutionary War literally began in Massachusetts. Lexington Green, There's the famous statue of the Minuteman in the background. And then, in the same day, he went to Concord Bridge. Same day. The rude bridge that arched the flood, I think, is what the poet said about that. And as you see him speaking there, just to the side of the famous Concord Bridge. Then came a series of additional events a year before the fact. He went to Fort McHenry in Baltimore on July the 4th, 1975, a year ahead. Then he started having seminars with historians, academic scholars, wise men like Daniel Boorstin, Irving Kristol, Notre Dame's president, Father Theodore Hesburgh, and Eugene Rostow, who was one of President Ford's professors at Yale Law School. And as Ford returned to the White House from that two-day visit to Massachusetts, a senior aide told me just a couple of weeks ago, he talked and talked and talked about how touched he'd been. He suddenly realized he had an important role to play. Finally, Ford had contracted, belatedly, but contracted a little bit of bicentennial fever. By then, his speechwriters had already begun reviewing the centennial of 1876, and they had gone back to review what President Ulysses S. Grant had done and said a century earlier. Curiously, 1876 was very low key. Grant's main event wasn't even on the 4th of July, nor was it in Washington. It was in Philadelphia, where 100,000 people gathered to hear Grant open the country's first World's Fair, also known as the Centennial Exposition on May 10th, 1876. Talk about underwhelming and prosaic. Grant's keynote address was just 6 paragraphs and pretty lame. This is the very best soundbite, he could summon up. Quote, "While we are proud of what we have done, we regret that we have not done more. Our achievements have been great enough, however, to make it easy for our people to acknowledge superior merit wherever found." When Ford was given the remarks to read, he couldn't believe how badly they were. But he was the 38th president, was determined to do better than the 18th, and given the low bar, that wouldn't be hard. But President Ford understood that it was very important. Ford understood that the country had come through seismic shocks: Vietnam, a presidential resignation, the Cold War, crippling economic challenges, extremely high unemployment, inflation, interest rates, crippling economic challenges, and he wanted to reassure his fellow citizens that while bruised and battered, America was still standing, and the future would almost certainly be better. Essentially, he was hoping to rekindle the spirit of '76. So, with the turn of the year, 1976, Ford's engagement accelerated. All of a sudden, a steady stream of newspaper, magazine, newsletter clippings began streaming from the Oval Office with blue felt-tip notes as guidance. When he saw something he wanted to see again, he would mark "Save for Bicentennial." He was particularly smitten by a stirring line he discovered from Thomas Jefferson, which rated a triple underlined notation, "Save for Bicentennial." Stay tuned for more of that. Ford also told aides that unlike President Grant, he was not interested in a single-shot speech. He wanted 4 to 6 appearances spread over several days. He stipulated forward-looking remarks. In one of these seminars, one of the wise men had told him the bicentennial should not be viewed solely as an antiquity, but had continuing relevance for future generations. Ford also wanted short drafts, not as short as Grant's, but 10 to 12 minutes, and he wanted them down to earth. Parenthetically, I would add, just like him. A staff memo prepared for the president summarized Ford's wishes this way, quote, "Noble and profound thoughts can be expressed in direct and simple words as Jefferson and Lincoln did. Any whiff of pomposity or pretentious elegance must be avoided." That is classic Jerry Ford. As his chief speechwriter and longtime confidant, Robert Hartman, told me at the time, I found what I wrote at the time, so this is not from memory, I found my document. He wants this stuff to read reasonably well 100 years from now, and Grant's speech does not, I'll say. Ford also tasked his staff to come up with an overarching theme, tying all of his remarks together over several days. 7 different topics were proposed, including the American experience, the American experiment. The winner was, and the winner is, the American adventure. According to Hartman, Ford liked adventure because it conveyed a sense of excitement where you don't quite know how things are going to come out in the end. So those were the marching orders, and by early June, a 4-inch thick volume of literally tens of thousands of words went to the president, in addition to more newsletters, more clippings, more magazines, more newspaper stories. It included 24 separate speech drafts. He wanted 4 drafts for each of the 6 speeches he was thinking about giving. The final formula had each of the 6 examining a discrete aspect of the American experience: the quest for the unknown, a reverence for the past, the national pursuit of happiness, a national spirit of sacrifice, and so forth. As the anniversary grew closer, Ford talked about it more and more with his staff. He could be heard reminiscing with aides about his own childhood, how excited he became by the fireworks and parades in Grand Rapids. And he told several aides the story about how his dad, quote, always coughed up a couple of bucks the day before for fireworks. He also remembered backyard picnics and fireworks with his own children in Alexandria, Virginia. One aide remembered Ford debating the merits of homemade ice cream, recalling with mixed pleasure about how that first shivering taste often brought a headache to the unsuspecting, including himself. Now, it's not surprising if you read those 6 speeches, the sentiments in the last 2 paragraphs that I've just mentioned, they're all into several of his talks. And if you were to read all of those and see the business about head freeze from ice cream, that's all from Gerald Ford reminiscing about the good old days when he was a kid. Finally, the 200th arrived a little early. The Bicentennial celebration actually began not on the 4th, but on a muggy Thursday, July 1st, on the National Mall, where President Ford dedicated the brand new Air and Space Museum, a perfect birthday present from the American people to themselves, he called it. Now here's a picture of the dedication. This is on the north side of the museum. Today, most customers go through the south entrance on Independence Avenue, but this is the north entrance overlooking the mall. And there's President Ford on the right, and you will see a red, white, and blue ribbon horizontally across the middle of this picture, and some kind of a weird gizmo in front there. Just before this happened, Ford talked about reaching for the unknown. Ford said, "The hallmark of the American adventure has been a willingness, even an eagerness, to reach for the unknown. Like our ancestors, we are always at the edge of the unknown, but the best of the American adventure lies ahead." Now, this was a pretty good speech, but the highlight wasn't his uplifting text. It was the actual opening of the museum with a high-tech assist from the Viking 1 spacecraft circling Mars at the time, millions of miles away. Midway through the program, a signal from the Viking craft began pulsing earthward to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, illuminating 2 green bulbs atop the museum. Mars is so far away that it took 18 minutes for the signal to make it to Earth, and a pair of lights suddenly began flashing, prompting oohs and ahs from the crowd. And 15 seconds later, the signal from space activated this gizmo here. It was about 10 feet long, copper colored. It was a boom, which, as you can see, was straddling the red, white, and blue ribbon stretched across the entrance, with a wisp of smoke and cries of, "It's moving, it's moving." The arm retracted across the tape, slicing and burning as it went, and this signal from far, far, far outer space clipped the cord, clipped the thing, and the dedication was complete. And President Ford had a great quip. He said, "The most expensive pair of scissors that man has ever made." A nice line. Now, the next day, July 2nd, he went to the National Archives. He wanted to see in person the original copies of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And you will see on the left House Speaker Carl Albert, on the right, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Warren Burger. "We stand awed in the presence of these great charters," Ford said. "They have guided us safely through 2 centuries of national independence, but the excitement of this occasion is that they still work." The next evening, Ford was at the Kennedy Center hosting a Trumpian-style Honor America gala featuring Bob Hope, the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, Art Linkletter, the Reverend Billy Graham, and many of the most famous artists and performers of the moment. And then finally, the main event. Valley Forge, July 4th. The president helicoptered with his daughter Susan to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Mrs. Ford came later in the day, and they almost didn't get in because there was terrible fog there. The press plane was going into Philadelphia, but we had delays because of the fog too. But he circled for more than a half an hour, and the clips at the time say that the Secret Service said that if they couldn't have gotten the helicopter down in another 10 minutes, he would have had to cancel Valley Forge, which would have been too bad, because he got there. Valley Forge, of course, we all know, is where George Washington's bedraggled army suffered through the winter of 1777. At a desk once used by the general himself, Ford signed a bill making the camp a national park. And I know in the video loop before we started here, thanks to Elizabeth, there's a picture of him signing the legislation turning Valley Forge into Valley Forge National Park. Then he flew to Philadelphia, but before he did that, there was one other thing he did. He met a group of hundreds of wagon trains which had come to Valley Forge from everywhere across the country, and he was going down the line greeting a few, and then he saw the Michigan wagon train. So the inner Michigander leaped out of him, and he jumped on the Michigan wagon train, and there he is. Then he flew off to the main event, Independence Hall, July 4th. Now, I used this picture once before, but I have it here because this is a picture I took. The Secret Service would never allow reporters that close to a president any longer these days, but they allowed us there, and I took that picture. There he's on the front lawn of Independence Hall, where, of course, as we all know, where the Declaration and Constitution were created in 1776 and later in 1787. He called them the two great documents that continue to supply the moral and intellectual power for the American adventure in self-government. He also reminded his fellow citizens that, quote, liberty is a living flame to be fed, not dead ashes to be revered, even in a bicentennial year. Then he helicoptered to New York Harbor, where Ford watched a parade of tall ships sail up the Hudson River north towards the George Washington Bridge. He watched all this from the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Forrestal. This is the official International Naval Review, a brochure that I've also said to my son, don't throw away. I guess I should send it somewhere because I'm not sure I'll be able to trust him. But that was the official Tall Ships International Naval Review of about 50 ships from dozens of countries. Almost all of them were ships of sail. And here President Ford is waving to some of the tall ships in the right from the Forrestal. And as this was going on, or before it was going on, he rang a bell on the deck of the Forrestal. That's the Bicentennial chairman, John Warner, who later became Senator John Warner and Mr. Elizabeth Taylor. But that's another story. Ford rang the bell 13 times in honor of the 13 original colonies. And he was out there for well over an hour waving to the ships. You can see, that's one of the tallest of the tall ships. Here's another one as it was getting very near to the George Washington Bridge. And that was pretty much the end of his time in New York. Parenthetically, the schedule didn't include one event that was in the original blueprint, which was an address to the nation from the Oval Office. Ford's advisors finally thought that would be a bad idea. They thought the audience would be minimal because most of the country would be participating in hundreds of their own home events. Event overload, one of his planners recalled last week. Nobody would be home to hear him. And of course, the real reason it never happened is the networks had no interest at all in a primetime bicentennial address from the Oval Office. This was before cable, this was before CNN, Fox, MS Now, multiple cable stations, OAN. And so there would be an audience for today, but not for 50 years ago. So he flew back to Washington, where here's President and Mrs. Ford watching the fireworks from the Truman balcony on the South Lawn. It was quite a spectacular fireworks show, and I've seen quite a few in the 58 years I've been in Washington. Anyway, even before returning to Washington to watch the fireworks, Ford had concluded it had been a really fulfilling holiday for him, for America, and for its president. And I must say, even for we in the traveling press, we had to stay back and file. Most of my colleagues were on deadline. I was at Newsweek, so I didn't have to, I had 3 days before deadline. But most of my colleagues had to write, and in the old days, you had to write, file, and then come home from wherever you were. So we missed the fireworks, but there was a nice little consolation prize. As reporters arrived at Andrews Air Force Base, the crew of our airplane were handed a model of our press plane. The Flying Colors press plane. Some of you may remember that Braniff International Airlines motto at the time was Flying Colors, and all of their aircraft were gaudy colors of pink and purple and orange and brown and kind of gray-green. And Braniff had commissioned Alexander Calder to do one airplane, a Boeing 727 in red, white, and blue. Calder himself supervised the painting of this plane, and it was, in fact, our press plane that day. Very cool. And I have only taken my model of this plane out of its box once, so it's very secure, and that one I think I'm going to send someplace so my grandchildren don't toss it or trash it. As a matter of fact, if you're an airline buff, the next time you go into the baggage claim at the new terminal in Grand Rapids, you'll see a 3 or 4 foot long model of this very same plane that was given to the city of Grand Rapids after the Bicentennial. That was among many mementos of flying with presidents. That was one of the nice ones. But it was very clear, as I said earlier, that Ford was on a real up. In his memoir, he wrote that as Air Force One returned from New York, aides gave me reports that millions of Americans were praying in their churches and synagogues, marching in their city squares, and dancing in their streets. Rarely in the history of the world had so many people turned out so spontaneously to express the love they felt for their country. Not a single incident marred our festival. The nation's wounds had healed. We had regained our pride and rediscovered our faith, and in doing so, we had laid the foundation for a future that had to be filled with hope. But Ford was not finished celebrating. The 4th had come and gone. His schedule had been so crammed from the 1st to the 4th, he couldn't squeeze in everything he wanted to do. So while the country returned to normal, on the following Monday, Ford helicoptered to Charlottesville, Virginia for his final address, a naturalization ceremony for hundreds of immigrants. Now, I have to say, and President Ford would good-naturedly agree if he were here, that he wasn't known for his oratorical skills. But I read all of his bicentennial speeches again 2 weeks ago for the first time in a half century, and he absolutely rose to the occasion. His remarks were elegant, inspirational, aspirational, and often moving. Somewhat ironically, they embodied what his predecessor, Richard Nixon, liked to call the lift of a driving dream, a phrase coined by Nixon's speechwriter Ray Price to symbolize an inspirational, unifying vision for America. Yet, as it turned out, he had several memorable phrases in his speech, but he'd saved the best for last on the front lawn of Jefferson's home in Monticello. After 2 centuries, there's still something wonderful about being an American, Ford told the new citizens, about 100 or so. If we cannot quite express it, we know what it is. You know what it is, or you would not be here today. Why not just call it patriotism? To be an American is to subscribe to the principles of self-government, liberty, justice, equal rights, and equal opportunities. These beliefs are the secret of our unity from diversity. In my judgment, the most magnificent achievement of our 200 years as a nation. Let me repeat that. Ford called America's melting pot diversity, quote, the most magnificent achievement of our 200 years as a nation. You don't hear sentiments like that much in D.C. these days. I cannot resist, without further comment, in noting that our current Secretary of Defense is called strength through diversity, the single dumbest phrase in military history. Unless you think I have a problem with the military, let me just parenthetically say, in my parallel life as a White House correspondent, I was a U.S. Army officer for 23 years. I revere the military. I revere the Pentagon. That's all I will have to say about that. Now, no doubt, President Ford would certainly agree that his inclusionary rhetoric that day in Charlottesville was shaped by something he learned in Sunday school. I heard him mention dozens of times the parable of Joseph's coat of many colors. The United States as a national policy and in the hearts of most Americans has been willing to absorb anyone from anywhere. We were confident that simply by sharing our American adventure, these newcomers would be loyal, law-abiding, productive citizens, and they did. 2 days later, Ford was still basking in a bicentennial afterglow when he welcomed Queen Elizabeth II to the White House. Something wonderful happened to America last weekend, he enthused. A spirit of unity and togetherness deep within the American soul sprang to the surface in a way that we had almost forgotten. We had a marvelous reaffirmation of the American spirit. Finally, Ford was so into the bicentennial spirit that he even told his friend Jack Marsh it was time to start thinking about sequels to the bicentennial after the November election, like the 200th anniversary of Valley Forge in 1977, the Battle of Saratoga in 1978, and so on and so forth. Well, just like Richard Nixon's dream of presiding over the bicentennial, things happened. But 50 years later, I think President Ford's stirring words offer us a hopeful counterpart to today's fractured, polarized, deeply divided country. There's no papering that over. Now, I suspect President Ford wouldn't be thrilled about some of the activities being planned for the 250th. He wouldn't have liked a Grand Prix auto race around the mall. He wouldn't have liked a cage fight on the south lawn of the White House. Jerry Ford was not into hoopla, not into spectacle. That's not who he was. But there's no doubt he would be thrilled about some of the activities being planned for the 250th, and he certainly would be proud of his country and his own stewardship this coming July the 4th. Let us all hope that our 250th birthday, however it transpires, can help us all rise above the vitriol and partisanship of the moment to recapture the spirit of 76, so eloquently embodied by the example of Grand Rapids and Ann Arbor's favorite son. And lest I forget, thank you for inviting me back to Michigan, the place he loved above all others. And I should say before I forget it again, go blue. Now, I want to thank everybody who's made it possible for me to be here and have a fabulous stroll down memory lane for me. I'm a sentimental guy, and this has really been good for me. And I want to thank Brooke and Joel and Stacy and Andrea in Grand Rapids, Tara. I will not remember every name, but you know who you are. Everybody from Brooke and Joel to the text to the photo people, everyone who has taken such good care of me. I've had a grand time. I hope we can do it, and I hope we all have a 250th that will be memorable enough that we can tell our kids and grandkids about it. Thank you all very much for having me come. Now, as I always say, I don't embarrass easily. I once did a speech for Newsweek advertisers in Dusseldorf, Germany. There were 9 people at the lunch. 5 of them were Newsweek employees, including me. Of the other 4 Germans, 2 spoke English. It was a long lunch. I will just say, if anybody's got to leave for whatever reason, don't be embarrassed. I just appreciate you coming very much. If you have a question or 2 or 3 or 4, until Brooke gives me the hook, I'm happy to entertain questions on anything that you might have on your mind. So don't be bashful. If you don't have questions, that's fine too. I've had a wonderful time, but if you have a question or 2, I'm happy to try to be helpful. Joel.
So you talk a lot about President Ford, and the 200th, I'm actually interested in what your favorite thing that you did on July 4th, not President Ford's, yours. What was
My favorite
what was your
one.
most memorable what was your most memorable event on July 4th?
My most memorable moment on the 4th of July, well, I could talk about the time that my four brothers got our father to put together money for Roman candles, and two of them exploded in our front lawn, and our father and mother were so upset. No more Roman candles for the rest of the 4th of July, for the rest of their lives, and the rest of our lives. Now, on the 4th of July with President Ford, I think Monticello is the one that is my favorite, and it's just too bad because it was on the 5th. The country had moved beyond the 4th. Nobody paid attention to that speech on the 5th, but if you go back and read that text and compare it to where we are as a country today, it's food for thought, and it was visionary, and President Ford would be concerned about some of the stuff that's going on, but that's not what I was asked to talk about. I just think his July the 5th speech in Monticello would be quite something. And also, I was on the pool after his speech. He went over and he shook the hands of every one of the 100+ new citizens. And then he went down to the Jefferson gravesite, just down the hill a little bit, to pay his respects to Thomas Jefferson. So that was a memory. That was a big league performance on an important day at an important venue, and I was glad of that. I'm sure I'm forgetting something. I mean, I love growing up in Texas near Dallas, I love getting a memento of the Flying Colors airplane, which I still have, which I don't want to sell. I don't want my kids to sell it either. But I'll probably think of something as we go along here if there are any other questions. But this is a picture of the 250th that President Trump tried out a couple of. This was New Year's Eve. New Year's Eve, January 1st of the sesquicentennial or semi-quincentennial celebration, which began on January the 1st, and there'll be more things to come. I have just so many memories. They're a jumble in my mind, but I'll keep thinking. Anybody else? Okay. I think we're done. I think we're going to have a little something outside here. And if you have any other questions, let's go out there. I'm happy to address them. I really thank you for coming. It's been a joy and a pleasure, and we'll see you again, I hope.
Well, thank you. I actually have a gift for you.
Thank
You
you
all. Yeah.
Thank you for coming. It's really been fun. This is one of my favorite places. I knew nothing about Michigan before I got the education of a lifetime from my favorite Michigander. Thank you very much. Thanks, Brooke.
Thank you, Mr. DeFrank. It's very good. And just so everyone knows, if you'd like to purchase his book, it is for sale in the lobby, and he will be available to sign books as well if you brought them in. So again, thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you again real soon.